So this video is going to give you an introduction to Sophists, particularly looking at what Sophists did in the Athenian society. You'll see there's quite a range of sources. It looks worse than it actually is. So there is varying sections of Plato, there's a short section of Aristotle, and then there's also some Xenophon. So one thing we need to keep in mind before we even look at sources is some source evaluation. So a lot of these sources are quite negative about Sophists. And this is because some of our key authors on Sophists were students of, or followers, of Socrates. Now, Socrates was, and here's a spoiler alert, was put to death for undermining essentially the Athenian democracy. Officially, it was for sacrilegion and for corrupting the youth. Now, Socrates, sorry, I said that really weirdly, Socrates was seen by many to be a sophist. And one of the questions we will look at is whether or not Socrates was actually a sophist or not. Because he's lumped with them, the people who followed Socrates or were his students are very critical of the sophists because they don't see Socrates being one and they don't like the fact that he's kind of being bundled into the same title as them. So the authors who really don't like the sophists are Plato and Xenophon. They have a real problem with them because their mentor was essentially killed because, well, for various reasons, but mainly for being a sophist. So when we're looking at people like Plato, Protagoras, and a few others, when they're talking about sophists, we do have to have this issue where they're going to portray them in a particularly negative light. Now, they might be incredibly accurate, we don't know, but what we do have to be aware of is there is this inbuilt-in negativity into these particular sources. So these sources we're going to look at are basically going to describe the kind of behaviour and actions by the sophists in Athens. So if we're looking at the first Platorius, that's making up a source and author, the first Plato source, he is quoting a sophist called Protagoras, and he's sort of suggesting what sophistry is really like and what it's all about. So Protagoras says, being a sophist is doing sophistry is a really old art, but people were aware that it was really unpopular, so they used to give it lots of cover names. And he gives a few lists, so poetry under Homer, Hesiod and Simonides, some prophecies to do with Orpheus and some others. And he kind of gives some sort of very different angles. Some call it gymnastics, so on and so forth. The key thing is they use these arts as disguises in their fear of unpopularity. So it would appear that sophists and what they stand for, it seems to be a little bit unpopular within Athenian society. And as we look through the next source, it becomes clear of why some people really didn't like them. So this Aristotle source doesn't say who he is particularly quoting here, but it is making the worse appear the better argument. And Protagoras was known for particularly teaching of this. So sophists essentially taught rhetoric, which is obviously giving speeches. And it becomes kind of this attitude that they were teaching people the ability to win an argument, not with good evidence, but with clever arguments. So they were kind of outwitting using words, not winning for the right reasons. And this is why these source authors and why these people up here were very critical of them. Because if you're winning an argument without using correct evidence, and we think about the People's Assembly, just the Assembly, and obviously people were listening to speeches in the Assembly before voting on really important things like law, war and peace, etc. If people are being won over by just clever arguments and not with proper facts, it could be seen as undermining the democracy. And that is certainly one of the criticisms that these authors often make about sophists, that they were doing damage to the democracy because they were allowing people like, well, let's be honest, Cleon, to become really popular. Because Cleon often doesn't necessarily win an argument because it's the best evidence, but because he's able to use rhetoric in a way to manipulate the people. And if we think about what the sources say about Pericles, Pericles is seen to have been taught rhetoric skills by a lot of very famous sophists. So it would be worth at some point going back over the source video, or at least the sources that talk about Plutarch. Oh dear me, sorry. That talk about the Plutarch source in terms of Pericles' earlier life, because it does show this kind of sophistry background that Pericles had and why he was able to be so successful, in the assembly. Anyway, so I'm kind of going off on a bit of a rant, but it is related to what the sources and what they're saying. So, he says here, it's this. Hang on, we'll highlight it. So the fact that they're using the arguments they're doing is, it is deceptive and not based on genuine art, but just on rhetoric. So these people are cheating the system because they're able to argue correctly. So then we have this Plato source on a sophist called Gregorius, who we will read a particular, sort of like a poem stroke speech. He'll be in a separate video later on. Very famous sophist at the time. So Plato was the student of Socrates. So he's quoting a conversation about that Socrates and Gorgias were having about sophistry, etc. So Socrates, what do you claim is the greatest good for mankind, for which you are the artificer? So in other words, you think you're doing the world good because you're teaching. Gorgias, the greatest good of all, Socrates, reasonable alike for the freedom of mankind and the individual's power to control others in his city. So he's admitting essentially that what's really important in the Athenian democracy in particular is the ability to sort of control other people, which makes sense because the People's Assembly is where everything was decided, so you have to give a good speech. So Socrates, what is that? And then we have really nice kind of examples of this. So Gorgias says, the power to persuade by words the jury in the law courts, the councillors in the council, the audience in the assembly, in short, any public meeting. This power will make your doctor and your trainer alike the slave of the man who yields it. So the power of rhetoric can get you anything you want in a public meeting. Now, Gorgias might have said this, it's possible, but what we definitely have is Plato putting a bit of a spin on this, saying, look how evil Gorgias was, because he's admitting that, the power of rhetoric means you'll make the people slaves of those who have the rhetoric skills. So this is very, very negative. So do take it with a little bit of a pinch of sauce. Salt. You can put it with a pinch of sauce. That would be kind of wet and sloppy and a bit gross, but you know what I mean. So then we have another section of Plato, same book, same content. So the ignorant will be more persuasive than the experts. Brilliant quote about sophistry and rhetoric. So Gorgias says, yeah, true. And then Socrates, doesn't your orator and his rhetoric stand in just the relation to all the arts too? He doesn't need to know the facts, but to discover the trick of persuasion. And this is the key criticism that sophists have against them, that you're not teaching a good skill, you're just teaching the ability to manipulate the people. And Gorgias says, isn't the world luxury, Socrates, without learning the other arts, but just this one, to come off no worse than the expert? So it's kind of, his argument is that he sort of elevates anybody to the same level as these sort of so-called experts in any topic, and puts you on an equal standing with them because you can give a good argument. It's an interesting argument that he makes. So then we have a different section of Plato, this time about Hippias, who is another sophist. Sorry, just rereading the source. So this is going to be overtly critical. So Socrates speaks. Look at Gorgias. Comes to Athens. Has been the most efficient in his country in handling politics. People thought he spoke very well in the assembly because he's able to give speeches. Teaching the young, he made a lot of money. So this is a key aspect of what sophists do. So yes, they are teachers, but they do expect to be paid for it. Shocking. But this is the criticism that Socrates had against sophists. He believed that education and learning was for everybody and shouldn't be just available to those who had money. So the sophists would end up teaching essentially the aristocrats and the middle class, etc., these skills, and everybody else just wouldn't get to be in that kind of ballpark. So it's not really about elevating anybody, it's just for the rich. Well, Socrates was well known for walking around the agora, so the marketplace, just kind of teaching anybody who he came across, whether you liked it or not, which is why I find Socrates really irritating, because he's just a bit annoying. But his point about how education is for all is a fair point, and this is the criticism he's making. These guys are being paid. This isn't altruism. This isn't what education is about. This isn't what learning is about. You shouldn't be paid for it. And then Socrates gives another example. So then we have Prodicus, who's another sophist, won high repute for a speech in the council. He gave instruction to the young received a staggering sum of money. And then he says, and there were others like Protagoras as well. And then Hippias, he can't help but boast, you don't know half of it, Socrates. If you knew how much money I have made, you would be amazed. And this is obviously, Hippias thinks it's a fantastic thing, but Socrates, and because Plato is the student of Socrates, is making the criticism. I think I can say I've earned more money than any other two sophists put together. So Hippias has made an absolute killing out of this education, and this is why the source is focusing on it, because Plato, who supports Socrates, and Socrates doesn't like the fact that these guys are being paid. It's like a little chain reaction of criticisms. So then we have Xenophon, who is another student of Socrates. Such then was his criticism of those who meddle with these matters. So he's talking about Socrates here. And he talks about his conversations that he'd have with people. So there's an idea that he was maybe questioning religion or not, just saying what is godly, what is ungodly, what's beautiful, what's ugly, what is just, what is unjust, what is government. These are sort of things that are used against Socrates later on in his trial, that he was kind of questioning religion or the rest of it. Socrates kind of really wasn't. He questioned everything. He wasn't trying to undermine the democracy. He certainly wasn't trying to undermine religion, but he just sort of questioned the world. And this is what Xenophon's trying to defend in Memorabilia. So Memorabilia is kind of like a set of memories about Socrates. And he's saying, this is what he's criticised for, but actually he was just doing what Socrates did, which is just question everything about it. 2.2.2, Socrates is thought to be wrong to enslave friends, but right to enslave enemies. So there's a criticism of this use of rhetoric that sophists were using. Later on in the book 1, so laws that lay down the death penalty, Xenophon points out, was used for theft and larceny, sort of picking pockets, housebreaking, kidnapping, lots of really awful things. And no one could have been further removed from these categories than Socrates was. So he's pointing out it's really unfair that Socrates was murdered in his eyes, or executed, when he had done nothing wrong. He was just questioning everything, and he was an innocent person, and he certainly didn't deserve to be murdered in his eyes or executed. So then he is quoting Socrates to another sophist called Antiphon. So those who sell wisdom for money to anyone who wants are called sophists, prostitutes, you might say. Ooh, ouch, Socrates. We regard it as proper conduct for a gentleman to befriend a person of quality by teaching him all the good that he can. And that's kind of Socrates' whole point, that sophists were prostituting themselves by charging money, when actually the right thing to do is just teach anybody anything, because it's for the good of everybody. It shouldn't just be for the elite. Then we come on to these two sections of Plato, which I'm not going to lie, it's like trying to read through treacle. It's really unclear and a bit sticky and unpleasant, because when treacle gets on the surface, it's really hard to clear up and it's gross. I hate this section of Plato. So much I had to read it about 6 times to get my head around it when I first started teaching the sophist stuff. So Plato, basically, in these two sections, is giving an analogy. And there's 2 different analogies. One is about a ship, which is here. And then there is one about a circus master, like an animal trainer, at the bottom. So I'll skip the first bit because it gives you like a really unexciting introduction. So picture a shipmaster in height and strength surpassing all others on the ship, but who is slightly deaf or has similarly impaired vision, whose knowledge of navigation is on par with his sight and hearing. Conceive the sailors to be wrangling with one another for control of the helm, each claiming that it is his right to steer, though he has never learned the art. They are always clustered about the shipmaster, importuning him and sticking at nothing to induce him to turn over the helm to them. Sometimes if they fail and others get his ear, they put the others to death or cast them out from the ship. So eventually they take over from the shipmaster. They take command of the ship, consume its stores, and drinking and feasting, make such a voyage of it as to be expected from such, as in the voyage goes really badly wrong. They praise and celebrate as a navigator, a pilot, a master of shipcraft, the man who is most cunning. They have no suspicions that the true pilot must give his attention to the time of the year, the seasons, the sky, the winds, the stars, and all that pertains to his art, for if he is to be a true ruler of the ship. So then there's a bit of an interruption where there's a bit of a conversation goes on between, I think it's Socrates, it is Socrates speaking, to someone else, and kind of says, questioning it a little bit further. Then Socrates makes the first one. I will explain this, don't worry. For it's not the natural course of things that the pilot should beg the soldiers to be ruled by him, or that the wise men should go to the doors of the rich. The true nature of things is that whether the sick man be rich or poor, he must need to go to the physician, and everyone who needs to be governed to the door of the man who knows how to govern. You will make no mistake in likening our present political rulers to the sort of sailors we are just describing. So if we go back to the description of the ship. So this is essentially Socrates' objection to democracy. So the ship owner is being compared to the Athenian democracy. So the ship owner's in charge, but he's obviously not capable of steering the ship because he's not very strong and he has limited sort of ability in seamanship. So according to Socrates, the seamanship here is representing the knowledge required to run the state. So the guy in charge of the ship doesn't have the knowledge in order to sort of run the ship properly. In other words, whoever's running the democracy hasn't got the knowledge to run the democracy properly. So meanwhile, the crew of the ship behave appallingly. They argue with each other rather than thinking what's best for the ship. They're only interested in satisfying their own selfish desires. So these guys, which are here, are representing the demagogues that were obviously who were within the city. So we're talking about criticisms like Cleon, Alcibiades, Nicias, etc. They dismiss the ship's navigator as a worthless stargazer, even though he's the only one who has the expertise to steer the ship well. Now, if I can find the stargazer bit in here again, because I've forgotten where he is. Stargazer. Why am I singing to you? You don't need to hear me sing. Sorry, I've lost stargazer. Oh, it's in here somewhere. It's down here somewhere. So the stargazer represents the educated, in inverted commas, philosopher king. So Socrates basically thought that only the most educated people should be in charge of everything. So he called these philosopher kings. And that's because these guys were the closest to truly understanding how the world worked, because they questioned everything, because they were philosophers. So this is his criticism of the democracy, that essentially there are idiots in charge who don't really know what they're doing, and then you also have demagogues trying to take over who really don't know what they're doing. And as a result, there's the navigator, sorry. As a result of all of this, everything kind of goes horribly wrong, and the state is falling apart as a result of it. Which I guess he's kind of right. I mean, things weren't great under Cleon and other people. But the idea that only this truly educated really know what they're doing is a little bit elitist, in my personal opinion. But, that's just me being a lefty, I guess. So anyway, we have another analogy, which is about an animal trainer. Okay, so each of these private teachers who work for pay, so these are about sophists. So he's going to be questioning about what sophists are like. It is as if a man were acquiring the knowledge of the humours and desires of a great strong beast, which he had in his keeping, how it is to be approached and touched, and when and by what thing it is the most savage or gentle. And after mastering this knowledge, by living with the creature and by lapse of time, should call it wisdom. But in reality, knowing nothing in reality about which of these opinions and desires is honourable or base, good or evil, just or unjust, but should apply all these terms to the judgment of the great beast. And the criticism here, is there any difference between such a one and the man who thinks it is wisdom to have learned how to know the moods and the pleasures of the motley multitude in their assembly? Okay, so he is comparing sophists to an animal trainer who has to basically control a large beast. And in my head it's a lion, but it probably isn't a lion. And the beast is the people. So we can find the beast in here. So this is the people in the assembly. So the trainer learns what the beast likes and doesn't like, so he knows basically how to control it. So as he can now know how to do this, he can in turn teach other people how to do it. And it doesn't think about whether or not what the animal, the people, desire what they desire is good or not. He just does. He simply calls what pleases the animal good and what annoys it bad. So in the same way, speakers in the assembly simply work out what the people want to hear, rather than trying to suggest policies which are truly good for them. So essentially, this section of Plato is really useful to tie into your demagogue section, because it is a criticism not only of sophists but of demagogues. Because obviously Aristophanes in Knights does use that kind of line, always cook something savoury that pleases them, to say whatever keeps people happy and you can control them. And that's basically what this part of Plato is making, exactly the same point, but in a really flowery way, using this really annoying analogy. And that is it for the sources at this particular point on sophists. And you look in the source book, you'll notice the sophist section is significantly longer than this video. Because of that, I'm breaking it down into different sources in particular to make it a little bit more easy to understand, and it really relates to different parts of the sophists question.